Hello students. We are going to move into the next section of our capstone course in strategic management and focus on analysis, both external and internal analysis. And if you recall the strategic planning cycle that we've discussed in the first lecture, we're going to start moving around the circle, covering bits of dimensions 1, 2, and 3 in this lecture, trying to understand the global environment, assessing trends, trying to differentiate between fads and trends, a very difficult thing to do, assessing strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. I'm sure you're all familiar with the SWOT analysis, having been through business school. It originated in strategy and has now been adopted in many other spots, and we're going to expand upon it here in this course, and we'll get into kind of more of the internal analysis. We talked a bit about mission and vision last time, but we'll spend a bit of time talking about resources and capabilities today. So if you recall my first discussion around imagining sort of three concentric circles where the company that you're attempting to analyze is a point on a map, on a whiteboard, if you will. Draw a big circle around that and call that the industry. So every company is embedded within an industry, and then a big circle around that yet we're going to call that the macro environment. So industries sit within a macro environment. We want to provide tools, heuristics to analyze the various threats, opportunities in each one of those, in each portion of those circles. First, we want to focus on is that macro environment. What do we mean by the macro environment? These are conditions that affect all industries that we need to be keeping an eye on to see how they can potentially impact changes in those areas can potentially impact our company. And we need to put our sort of futurist hat on to think about what might be coming and prepare for it. So the first tool, as you can see here, is called the PESTLE analysis. It stands for political, economic, sociocultural, technological, environmental, and legal aspects of the macro environment. And each one of these areas can provide sweeping changes that can impact the industry within which we are embedded and our company itself. So imagine, if you will, the university that you're currently taking courses from in this environment, in this macro environment, with the threats of COVID and the doomsdayers discussing what might be the result for higher education. I want you to think about it, any industry and any company, in terms of what political changes, what government action, what labor law, trade restrictions, how might that impact the business that you are looking to analyze? Economically, what do exchange rates? What are changes in unemployment? How does that affect? Boy, right now that's a big concern for many companies. And this is also where we can begin to see a conversation around what's a trend and what's a fad. Is a recession, is that a trend, or is that a fad? I want you to consider those kind of thoughts. If you see a recession coming down and you want to respond to it within your business, be careful not to over-respond, because we know what recessions do. There's a bounce back at some point. So we've seen companies overreact to what I would call a fad or a temporary condition, an ephemeral condition, versus a trend in the marketplace. Sociocultural, the S, this is what sort of the demand side of it. What are your customers? What are the changes in your customers' likes and dislikes? Are there lifestyle changes? Is there more of an emphasis now, if we're talking post-COVID, on health and safety? What's the population doing? Is it aging? Is it depending on where? Because again, you're wearing the hat of a large corporate CEO, so you're in marketplaces around the world with different demographics, and remember your market segmentation lecture, different needs, different desires. Technology, how does technology impact your industry? This one really involves putting your futurist hat on. How is automation, how is machine learning, artificial intelligence going to affect your business and your industry? biotech, right? There's a lot of ways that technology you can imagine coming to impact your industry. And your job as a CEO and a strategist of a large corporation is to be able to adapt to that, to see those trends coming and be able to adapt. Environmental, we will discuss multiple articles where we have to consider how the threat of climate change may impact business. We've got a large hurricane season coming up here in Florida. What is the impact of that, at least temporarily? What other NGOs, nonprofits, non-governmental organizations may be coming into the space, receiving a ton of funding to either challenge some of your market dominance if you're in a space, or where you're going to bump up against them, or if they could affect your supply chain. So there's a lot to consider there. And then legal, antitrust laws, intellectual property laws, health and safety laws. We consider the post-COVID environment in higher education and other, in particular, but in businesses across the board. What will be the impact, and it remains to be seen, on workplace safety lawsuits, OSHA lawsuits that may come as a result of employees, or in our case, faculty, getting sick. So again, the pestle analysis is used to assess the macro environment, and this will be a tool that I want you to become familiar with throughout this course, and refer back to this this presentation, this PowerPoint on YouTube whenever you need a refresher. So next, let's switch gears and talk a bit about sort of strategy. Your projects is to create strategic maps. So let's stick with the retail industry, and let's discuss on a strategic map where where these same companies might line up. And you can choose anything on your X and Y axis here. We're going to stick with the same theme on the generic strategies for this example, talk about price and quality on the Y axis from low to high, and on the X axis, the broad spectrum, the coverage of the market from few to many locations. But again, you could use any success factors or driving forces, or whatever we call it, those key factors that create competition, or and you can look these up in a variety of different sources through the library, but financial analysts measure these key success factors for industries. There will typically be a pretty decent list that you can pull up quickly, and you could use anything to plot. So on any axis you want to plot companies within the industry to find opportunities to potentially expand. So again, let's look at the map here, or the strategic map. And if we start on the bottom right, we can see again, we're seeing the low quality, low price, and broad coverage is the Walmart, the Kmart. You can see as we move sort of up to the left, we're getting higher value and kind of fewer stores, less geographic coverage. So we move up from Target, we get into our individual shops, and finally toward the top, at the very top there, you can see really differentiated and very narrow market, or our really high-end Gucci, Fendi, Chanel type stores. So again, use whatever axes make sense, and I would recommend that you use multiple success factors and create multiple strategic maps, because what we're looking for, if there's white space in a strategic map, you may have found an opportunity to expand. It also may be because there may be white space because it's impossible to get there. For example, the top right quadrant here, to have broad coverage with a high value, high differentiation, and a high price, it may just prove impossible to be competitive in that space, which is why we have white space up there. However, if done correctly, this can provide some opportunities and tell you maybe where to avoid competing. Okay, so the last tool that we'll use to understand the industry is something you're also probably familiar with from previous courses you've taken in the program, but it's Porter's 5 forces. And what I'm interested here, what we're interested in strategy here in doing, is understanding the relative power of these 5 forces on your company. So what is the bargaining power of buyers vis-a-vis your company? The bargaining power of suppliers, the threat of substitutes, the threat of new entrants, and then the threat of rivals or existing competitors. So you'll go through an analysis, and when you found your company, for example, if you're the university, we'll come back to that example. The bargaining power of buyers. The buyers in a university, those are your students and your parents, right? That we would rank these in a low, medium to high. And the bargaining power of buyers, in the universities is very high. There's plenty of universities out there, and parents and students are very particular about where they will go. And it's our job as university administrators and faculty as well to attract students. So you have a lot of power in the relationship as buyers. The threat of substitutes for a university setting, like a major university, is probably, especially at a university like the University of Tampa, previous to COVID, we had never done online education. So we could consider a substitute being online programs. Substitutes could be trade schools, vocational schools. They could be students or college age people choosing the military or Peace Corps. Those could all be substitutes for the college experience, the university experience. And I would say that that's probably, at least for the University of Tampa, a fairly low threat of substitute. They have relatively low power versus the University of Tampa. That may be changing a bit if after the COVID chaos subsides, if online education becomes more evident in the marketplace. But for now, the threat of substitutes remains rather low. The threat of new entrants for a university, again, like at University of Tampa, is probably on the lower side. We have the highest accreditations, really well qualified faculty, obviously a beautiful campus that's difficult to replicate. And not to mention there are some barriers to entry for universities to enter the space. For a while there was conversation, this was when the private universities, University of Phoenix and others started popping up, there was concern about disruption to the university model, but many of those have struggled more than the traditional brick and mortar universities for a lot of reasons. So the threat of new entrants, at least for a University of Tampa type of a university, is probably relatively low. If you're a private university or more of a less differentiated, less specialized, less, frankly, beautiful university, it may be higher. The threat or the bargaining power of rivals, of existing competitors, is pretty darn high. We would say that we would choose the high end of that spectrum as a threat or as a force, because there are a lot of other universities. Students, again, have a lot of choices, and while the University of Tampa has a really stellar ranking in a lot of ways, there are better ranked universities. We managed to be priced relatively favorably compared to most, so that gives us some advantage there, but that's certainly a force that we need to consider. And when you have a high force, that means we need to strategically be thinking about that pretty regularly. And then finally, the bargaining power of suppliers. Who are the suppliers to a university? Well, probably the faculty, maybe the staff, maybe the administration. Well, probably not the administration, but faculty for sure. And our bargaining power in some universities, especially a lot of the public universities have unions, so they're unionized faculty. They have more power than we would at the University of Tampa as a private school with no unions. But our credentials and experience in the marketplace makes us a little more powerful than other workers potentially, and including, particularly when we consider the tenure aspect of our jobs. Tenured faculty are a fairly powerful lot. So if we had to probably put it on a spectrum of high, low, and medium, I'd put it somewhere in the middle in terms of the bargaining power of suppliers. The university needs to consider its faculty when making strategic decisions, but it doesn't need to necessarily be the first and foremost on their mind. Really, the consideration is where those forces are high, which are the buyers and the competitors. Okay, so that will do it for the external analysis. I told you before that we would talk about the SWOT analysis as well. I'm not going to bring a slide up because I know that you've all covered it many times. And I would just say to recall that if we're talking the external versus internal analysis, the SWOT analysis kind of does both nicely. The opportunities and the threats aspect of the SWOT. Our external analysis, the strengths and the weaknesses, look inside the company. It is a nice transition as you put your, as you're analyzing a company and you're coming up with strategic recommendations. The SWOT can be a nice sort of a segue into those recommendations after you've conducted your analysis of the macro environment with the PESTLE and the industry with the 5 forces and strategic maps, and the internal with resources and capabilities and possibly a VRIO analysis. Then you can use a SWOT analysis to kind of bring all that together and kick off your recommendations. So moving internal. So we're now inside the company. And I want to talk first about resources. The key thing that I'm after with, and we're after in strategy with internal analysis, are resources and capabilities. What are resources? Well, there's some obvious tangible resources out there. What locations are we in? What technological infrastructure, plant, property, equipment? Do we have cash in the bank? Do we have highly skilled folks working for us? Do we have economies of scope and scale? These are very easy to dissect, tangible resources. Do we have access to a raw material, right? That can provide us advantage. But don't forget about the intangible resources. Do we have intellectual property, patents, copyrights? Do we have exclusive access to some of those resources? Do we have exclusive access to markets, exclusive access to licenses? What's our brand worth? That's a heck of a resource. What sort of partnerships do we have? Have we built in switching costs for customers? Have we built in a network effect? The last two I'll spend a little more time talking about, just to make sure we clarify what they mean. Switching costs are making it a little painful for customers to leave your company and choose a competitor's products or services, right? This is why airlines and other businesses choose to offer fairly generous rewards programs, because the idea being that once they get you accruing awards, it becomes difficult to want to give up on those rewards and change to the competitor. The network effect, think here of Facebook and eBay. The more people are using it, the more valuable it is. Facebook wouldn't have any value if only a few of us were on it. It becomes valuable because of the network that it's built. So a lot of these, in particular the network effect, the switching costs, the intellectual property, the exclusivity, and even the partnerships, really, these can be really big sources of competitive advantage. And remember the 3-word key phrase that we're using for strategy. We're after sustainable competitive advantage. And these are some areas that really can provide that sort of sustenance of advantage. So that's resources. What are capabilities? If resources are things that we have, capabilities are things that we do. And I'm going to break these down into 2 different types of capabilities: static capabilities and dynamic capabilities. Static capabilities, these are things, capabilities that will provide us some advantage in any sort of industry condition that we might happen to be in, whether we're in upheaval, the industry is in upheaval and turmoil, or whether it's relatively stable. These things like efficient supply chains and optimized manufacturing and just really operational efficiency in general, distribution and logistics system. Do we have a great customer service program? How's our marketing, sales, advertising? These are skills and capabilities that will help us thrive in any environment. But dynamic capabilities are vital for companies that are competing in high velocity markets, markets that are constantly changing, where technology is a big part of competition in those spaces. And really, these dynamic capabilities have become, in the information age, more and more vital for companies to develop. So research and development, right? What's our innovation process look like? How long does it take us to get our new product or service to the market? How open are we? How receptive are we to external information? We talked about the macro, we started this lecture with the macro environment in the industry, right? If the key to strategy is assessing or recognizing trends and being able to adapt, we have to be receptive to that information. Many companies get complacent with success, and they think because they're making money now that that'll continue forever, and they miss changes that happen right under their noses that they should have seen. So we have to be receptive to receiving external information. And then it's not enough just to be receptive to it. We also have to be flexible enough to change. So our internal processes need to be malleable enough that they can adapt to that new information. Again, if we see a major change coming down the pike, it can't take us a year to retool our entire back office to be able to handle it. We need to be flexible and able to move nimbly and quickly. Okay, so that's the key aspect of the internal analysis: resources and capabilities. And again, we'll use those in a SWOT analysis later to be able to say what resources, what capabilities, provide us strength vis-a-vis our competitors. Where are we weak vis-a-vis our competitors? What opportunities exist in the marketplace and what that our strategies can help us to take advantage of, or that our weaknesses are keeping us from taking advantage of. Same with the threats. What threats are coming that we have strengths to overcome, or weaknesses that maybe make us more susceptible to those threats that are coming. And the last thing I wanted to talk about here in the internal analysis, so I guess I lied. That wasn't the end of your internal analysis. I want to consider the value chain as well. You're probably all familiar with the supply chain, the raw materials up to your business, right? Whatever it takes to get the materials to you to manufacture, to distribute, right, to get to your customer. So we're familiar with the supply chain. The value chain just sort of extends that. So if we're sort of in the middle and we're handling, we're a retail or a wholesale shop, and we've got inbound logistics, all that, the supply chain coming to us, but then we've got the other side of it, the value chain, which gets to customer service and after sale service as well. The reason why this is important is because when you are analyzing strengths, weaknesses, resources, capabilities, you need to look in each aspect of the value chain for potential advantage. I can't stress that enough. It's not simply your current set of operations, because when we get into the formulation of strategy, we're going to talk about horizontal and vertical integration and diversification. And without understanding our value chain, we won't be able to determine whether or not those are potential opportunities for us. So we need to understand our inbound logistics. What does it take to get the raw materials to us, right? Where do we get them? Where do we store them? How do we transport them, right? Then our operations come into play. Then our outbound logistics, once we've converted it, the raw materials into something that we're going to sell to customers, what does it take to get it to them? What sort of fulfillment process do we have? What sort of delivery do we have? And these are all areas that we can find advantage or find weakness. What sort of marketing and sales engine do we have attached to that? What's our pricing? Again, customer service, I talked about this before. The value chain is important because it considers this. There are companies out there that make their name and achieve advantage and build in switching costs just based on the service that they provide to customers. So those are the primary activities. And then sitting above those are your support activities on the top. So you've got your infrastructure, sort of your back office, finance, legal, management. You've got human resources. You've got technology. and you've got procurement. So let's look at briefly what, if we're trying to look at trends and assess trends and see what's coming forward. Let's look at what the value chain might look like in the fourth industrial revolution that folks talk about us being in now. So on the far left, you can see on the value chain itself, there are these aspects of the value chain, and let's talk about what we see as priorities within each section. So R&D, research and development, innovation, developing new things. We're seeing trends toward collaboration. We're seeing trends toward open innovation. Whereas in the past, engineers made decisions and came up with innovations internally within the company. Now that's becoming more open. It's happening through partnerships. It's happening through conversations with stakeholders, with folks in the periphery of the organization, even with customers who help co-create the product or service that they ultimately receive. So we're seeing more openness and more collaboration there. In the procurement side, we're seeing a lot of flexibility with how materials are procured now. For a long, long time, China was the go-to for nearly everything, and now that's shifting. Obviously, our relationship with China, back again to the pestle and the politics involved. But also, as their economy matures, they become more expensive. So we're seeing more flexibility in the procurement side of things. Fabrication is changing with 3D printing, with robotics. Oh my gosh, this is really going to only increase in the future in terms of disruption. Distribution. Warehouses look different now. Amazon's warehouse, it's worth a tour if you get to see it. Totally automated, really interesting. If we talk about self-driving trucks, what does that do to the distribution costs along the chain? Marketing in the fourth industrial revolution. We've already seen omni-channel retail now. Very few companies who are successful, at least on any sort of scale, are only brick and mortar, are only online. There's a recognition now that we need to be able to serve, we need to be able to sell to customers wherever they might be, whether it's on social media, whether it's through a website, whether it's through events or a brick and mortar shop. And then services, right? The after sales service. We talk about customer service and we think about somebody answering the phone, but guess what? You've got the greatest customer service device, most of you sitting right in your house with the Echo or the Alexa, or whatever that the smart home might look like in the future. That's really about service and after-service sales and generating additional sales. So that's the thrust of what I wanted to discuss today for the external and internal analysis. In class, again, we will go over the TOES. So we're going to take the SWOT analysis and transform that into a TOES matrix, which then will transition some of your work into recommendations. And then we'll start on the formulation of strategy. But this lecture is meant for you to come back and repeat as often as you need. Remember, macro environment with the pestle analysis, industry with the strategic map and the 5 forces, internal analysis with resources, capabilities, and the value chain analysis.